Okay. All right. Good morning, everybody. Why don't we get started? What we were learning about yesterday is the whole principle uh, of what's called hezek re'iyah, of not looking askance or looking really gazing at my friend's property or at his person, because we know that there's this concept in halacha called ayin hara, where I could even inadvertently cause injury or harm to my fellow or his property because of my gaze upon it, because of my mental energy that is somewhat metaphysical. Okay. And um, the discussion of the biurim in this very, very long biurim that sort of cuts through over 2 pages. Okay. What was his discussion? The discussion is, if you want to do renovation on your house and you want to be able to add additional rooms so that you can rent out your house to tenants, so that you're actually adding traffic to the neighborhood or to your neighbor's property, in the sense that whereas before he was only sharing a courtyard, let's say, with one neighbor, and now he's going to share the courtyard with an additional tenant. Do you need to procure his permission in order to be able to do that renovation? Or even if you're not renovating, do you need to get your neighbor's permission if you're going to be taking on a new tenant, by just adding renting out a room in your house? And so this is a very lengthy discussion that he engages in. But in the very end, and he brings a number of different opinions, whether you have to get permission or not before you're permitted to do it. And if you don't get permission, whether your neighbor can prevent you from bringing in tenants, where there's going to be more, where the two of you are sharing space. Now that the additional tenant will be sharing that space as well. And the bottom line, he basically says, he quotes from the Meiri, who's one of the medievalists, that it all depends upon the minhag hamakom. It all depends upon what municipal law has to say about it. And you have to go according to what the municipality says about creating a denser population in a shared space, in a shared area. So that's just the bottom line. I just wanted to let you know we're not going to go through that whole discussion. What we're looking at now is this halacha that we saw yesterday, that if two people share a courtyard or share an outdoor space, let's say two neighbors whose houses open up into a shared space, you have to do whatever you can, he says in the Rav Shulchan Aruch, to create a partition within the yard, even if it's a mechitza kala, even if it's a lightweight wall, it's a weak wall that's made out of flimsy material, to be able to obstruct the view from each neighbor's activity from the other. And he then said, if they can't do it for whatever reason, each neighbor has to be careful to not look upon the activities of his neighbor in the courtyard. Of course, obviously, that would be very difficult if you're dealing with a shared space. But as Paul had you had mentioned at the very end of this year, this is a hallmark of the Jewish people. When Bilam saw their tents, he said, "Matovu ahalecha Yaakov mishkanosecha Yisrael." How goodly are your tents, so Jacob. So the rabbis interpret that to mean that one of the things that he noted was very praiseworthy, was that everyone's tent doorway was facing away from the other person's tent, because of that trait of modesty, that we didn't want to flaunt or show off to our neighbors what we were doing internally. And then the rest of the halacha went to a discussion of, you're not allowed to, obviously not allowed to peer into your friend's house, even if the window is open, unless the neighbor gives you permission. And this is true, he said, even if the occupant, sees you looking in and doesn't say anything, doesn't try to shoo you away, because maybe he's embarrassed. And then he said, "Vafilu nasan lo chaveru rishus liftoach chalon lechatzero lo nasna lo ela laora aval asu lo lamod bechalon liros bechatzer chaveru." Even if your friend gives you permission to open a new window, which will open up into your backyard so that you can see everything that he's doing, he did not give you permission to gaze upon his activities. He's only giving you permission to have an additional circulation and light in your house. He's being a nice guy, but that's not a tacit invitation to go ahead and look upon what he's doing in the privacy of his own backyard. Okay, so we had started looking at the Imrei Yaakov, and he had said at the end of this Sifkatan Nun Tes, he said, "Va'ayin biurim divrei maschal lasos le'inyan zmanenu shalonohagu lahakbid al zeh." He says, as we'll see in a moment, societal norms have changed. Functional utilities of courtyards have changed from the time that when this halacha was written. Now, what does he mean by that? So let's take a look at the biurim over here. Lasos mechitza. You should do whatever is in your power to create this partition in the courtyard. Kosav haramasim in kufnun zayin sif aleph. Dafilu yesh minhag beir shelo la'asoso. Ein holchim achara v'kofin la'asoso ad kan l'shana. The Ramah goes so far as to say that even if the standard custom of your locale is not to make a wall, not to make a partition, so important is this law of tznius, of privacy, that if you're a frum Jew and your neighbor's a frum Jew, you should feel compelled to abide by this halacha, even though no one else in the community is doing it. Amnam nira de bizmanenu nishtana din zeh. However, then Rav Stern writes that it seems to me that nowadays the halacha should be different. Machmas shinoi hametzius v'derech ha'olam. He says, because people behave differently today. De'ein hayom haregilus lihishtamesh b'chatzer kibiyameha. Because we don't use outdoor properties that are adjacent to our homes in the same way that people use them in the times of the Gemara. Uche'ein zeh kasav hachazon ish yoredeya le'inyan chiyav mezuzah b'petach hapatuach lechatzer. And my proof is that the Chazon Ish himself writes about this, not in relation to our halacha of Choshen Mishpat, of making a partition, but rather regarding the laws of mezuzah. What does this have to do with the laws of mezuzah? The yesh lekova abiyamin hakenisa labayit. He says, let's say you have a courtyard that two houses open up to one shared courtyard. In the times of the Gemara, people use their courtyards as an extension of their homes to do general chores that had to do with just either their livelihood or the maintenance of their families. And as a result, when you have a door that goes from your house to the courtyard, if you view your courtyard as an extension of your house, then you would put the mezuzah on the right side of the door going out into the courtyard. But the Chazon Ish writes that was back then. Today, we don't use backyards with the same utility as we used to do in the times of the Gemara. And therefore, he maintained that you should put the mezuzah on the right side of the door going into the house from the backyard. And he writes as follows: V'gam divrei maharil eino ela b'chatzer shelahem shahayu mishtamshim bo batechina uba'afia ubishtichat perei sha'ar tzarachim. He writes, he says, the maharil had written that you should put the mezuzah on the right side going out from the house into the courtyard. Why? He says, because back in that in those times, in ancient and medieval times, people would use their courtyards to grind their wheat and to bake, because they would keep their ovens outdoors. Remember, ovens were kept outdoors because of the smoke, and it was more economical to keep the ovens outdoors. And people would dry fruits by laying them out in the sun in their backyards. In other words, your backyard was a place where you did the household chores. You did the laundry outdoors, right? People would have, let's say, a trough, and they would do the laundry outdoors. A lot of more physical activities were done adjacent to the house in the courtyard. And for that reason, the courtyard was an extension of a person's household. And many times people dine outdoors and they sleep outdoors, like certain kinds of laborers that were around in those times. But the Chazon Ish writes that nowadays people only use their courtyards for just getting some fresh air. And as a result, since it's only for getting fresh air, and the utility of your backyard is not as extensive as it used to be, you would therefore put them as, it's not considered to be a regular living space where you would put them, it's considered to be another room of your house, so that it gets a mezuzah from the house going out into the courtyard. But rather you view it as another entryway into your house, and therefore you would put the mezuzah on the right side from the courtyard going into the house. And then he writes, Shuv ra'isi b'Chazon Ish bava basra siman yud beis sivkat and gimel, shekasav lahedya, she'etzleinu she'ein anu regilim b'tashmish tzanua b'chatzir, nira destamahu al derech liftoach halonos adkan. He's al das liftoach halonot adkan. And the Chazon Ish then writes, in relation to this halacha, that since we don't use our courtyards or our backyards anymore for private activities, it would seem to him that it would be okay to allow neighbors to have visual access to the courtyards. He's talking about letting a neighbor open up a window to the courtyard. It's not a problem. You don't have to ask specific permission, right? Because people don't use their backyards anymore for a private activity. So basically what Rav Stern is writing is that there's not the same level of halachic urgency to put up a partition between two neighbors' backyards, since at the end of the day, they're not using it for such extensive private activity as it was done in the time when this halacha was originally written. And I'm thinking to myself as I read this, that I think a lot, I hear his point, but I'm not so convinced in the way that I see people using backyards today for barbecues. Certainly when the climate is milder, people will quite often eat outside every day from spring until fall. A lot of families will use their grill as a way of just making dinner on a regular basis. And so I think that it does depend upon the cultural standards of whatever community you're living in. I'd love to hear your feedback, because I know that, let's say where I live, the neighbors on both sides of me use their backyards periodically, but one of my neighbors has a swimming pool, and another one of my neighbors and everyone has a grill, including myself, outside. And I'm not sure that I would be completely comfortable setting up a table and having a nice dinner with my family or friends, entertaining guests outside, if there were no walls between my neighbor and myself. And so it could very well be that the Chazon Ish's understanding was based upon his time and place, sometime in the 1940s or 1950s when he wrote this halacha. But since then, people have become much more outdoorsy. and it depends on where, and it depends on what circumstances. So anyone want to comment on this? Okay.
Not so much on that, but it's interesting that when subdivisions are put up, and maybe David knows more about this, but I know even in my block, a number of the houses don't have fences. They weren't built with fences, and then it's up to the new owners to negotiate fences up. So there's several houses behind me that aren't fenced. I think young families like it because then the kids can play in a large backyard. That's a common sort of area, but this is interesting just from that standpoint.
Yeah, and I've lived in different places, like in Pennsylvania, where we lived many, many years ago. There were no in many communities there were no where the population is more, the houses are a little bit more spread out, and there was a lot of grass, a lot of yard space. In Ohio, also, it's like that, where there are no walls in between the properties because sometimes the acreage is so large that it's cost prohibitive for a lot of families who are middle class to put up a very, very long fence or wall between the properties. And you're right, it's sometimes better for the families to have more wide open space. And I guess it all depends upon the proximity between one house and another. There's a lot of circumstances that are subjective in this. So remember, when we started this halacha, the Imrei Yaakov basically said that these halachas of hezek re'iyah are midat chasidut, that many of them have to do with the pious or moral thing to do, but not necessarily are halachically actionable. So, but at the same time, he said something that was very surprising yesterday, that Rav Shulchan Aruch had said that even if you need to take charity money, community money that is designated for charity, in order to make this partition, you are entitled to take money from tzedakah in order to create this partition. So I really do feel that this is a subjective halacha that is dependent upon the way that people use their courtyards. But certainly, if the neighbors are on top of each other, which is probably true in most houses in Thornhill, I would guess, like in our neighborhood, it is correct and proper to put up these fences. Although I will say this, that the fact that neighbors can see each other from one yard to another has proven to be beneficial during COVID. Like this Theodore Minion, for those of you who live in the area, they have this shared space among the neighbors that even though they're divided by walls, you can peer over the walls if you're sitting on your deck or something like that. And then you can have a minyan with a group of neighbors. So I find that to be interesting as well. Okay.
Maybe there's an ethical message here on top of the physical about the walls, and that's just we should always act with sneers. And even if whether there's walls or not, we should keep what's private and what's public. And I guess even the use of a common space.
Yeah, you raise an interesting point. How much of the laws of tznius are the responsibility of the actor, and how much of it is the responsibility of the viewer? It seems to place a large amount of onus upon the viewer in this halacha, and not upon the actor. Right. In other words, the person who's engaging in activity. So the assumption I think that the Shulchan Aruch is working under is that the person doing the activity is going about his regular daily affairs. He's not being an exhibitionist by going outside and being boisterous or noisy for no reason. He's let's say doing his laundry or making dinner for the family or doing any other kind of household activity that was normally done outdoors. Or let's say it's just a beautiful day and he wants to be able to do a barbecue. So there's no onus upon the individual who's going about regular activity to safeguard that activity to make sure that people cannot see it. It's really the responsibility of the neighbors to avert their gaze upon what another person is doing, but how much of it is the responsibility of the actor himself or herself? So maybe we'll see as we go through this halach a little bit further, maybe we'll see some qualifications.
It's kind of like what we say about Lashon Hara, that there's two sides to it. It's not just the speaker, but the listener. So I guess it's the one who demonstrates as well as the one who watches the demonstration, potentially.
Yeah, but certainly the speaker of the Lashon Hara is far more liable than the person who's the listener.
Yeah.
Okay. Now they have to put up. So the Imrei Yaakov continues this discussion in his commentary. They have to put up some kind of wall, even a flimsy wall, that can create a visual obstruction. He says, "V'imnagu b'mechitza kala ma'od she pachos mikanim v'hutzim." He says, if the convention, when creating a partition between two neighbors, is to create a partition that's even flimsier than something that will obstruct view, such that the neighbor will still be able to look through a peephole and see what, or look through the holes of the fence to see what his neighbor is doing. So according to some opinions, we don't follow the standard minhag, but rather we have to go above and beyond for reasons of tznius, of privacy. Im ein hasheni merutza lazeh, diachol omar ein ratzoni begeder kol tehu diipol. He says, because the other neighbor, as long as the other neighbor feels uncomfortable with it, because he could say, I'm not comfortable with a flimsy wall that could easily fall down. Ve'itzterich lachzer v'litroach bevin yano. And he's actually over here, I think he's talking about the quality of the construction. He says, let's say you have a code, and the code is very lenient as far as what the partition needs to be made out of. Can you rely on the code, or can a neighbor say, I want a sturdier wall? He says that according to some opinions, if the neighbor protests and says, I want to share the cost of a sturdier wall, you have to accommodate his desire, because his argument would be is that if we build the flimsy kind of wall that the minimum code allows for, it's just going to fall down eventually, or it's going to crack and break, and we'll have to build it all over again, and it's going to end up costing more money. But he says, V'im ein minhag yadua be'ir yitaken kefi ra'ot einei hadayan al pi mumchim. But if there is no standard, and the neighbors now just want to know what level of sturdiness the wall should be, and they have a difference of opinion, they should go to a judge who will consult with the builders, and he will paskin how strong the wall should be. V'imkanu miyado livnos mechitza lo yuchal lachzor bo, the livnos lo mikri kinyan devarim. He says, now let's say if there was already a kinyan, like they did an actual transaction to build a wall. Who were they? Right. In other words, I guess if two neighbors entered into an agreement to build a mechitza, neither neighbor is allowed to go back on the agreement. He says, because when you make an agreement to build, that's not called just a verbal commitment. It's considered to be a halachic commitment. He says, V'yesh cholkim al zeh, keven she'en hakinyan nofel al ha'adam ha'mitchayev v'lo al guf ha'mamon, ela al ha'netina atzma, v'ha'netina ein ba'mamish ela ma'isa ba'alma. So I'm not really sure what he's referring to over here. He says that there are some who disagree, and they say that the kinyan that is made is not really designated. Maybe it's a kinyan that the two of them make with the dayan, that they agree that they're going to build the wall. But some people disagree and say that it's not. It doesn't have the same standard force of a full halachic commitment. Why? He says because the kinyan that is made is not going on the person himself or on the money that is being transacted, ela al hanatina atzma, v'hanatina in b'mamish ela ma'isa ba'alma. Havikinin dvarim umatzi hadarbe, aval im kanu minei de mishabed nafshe livnos, o mechayiv atzma liten kach v'kach, mahani l'kulei alma da havi derech hoda'a o shibud. I'll have to research this a little bit better, but he basically says that the only way to make a binding contract, to be legally bound to build a wall, is if they make a kinyan that each party subjugates himself to personally to make sure that the wall goes up, or that each party commits himself to give a certain amount, minimal amount, towards the construction of the wall. Once those commitments are made, then it becomes a binding agreement, and neither party is allowed to retract on the agreement. Okay, but I'm not sure what he means in the first part. I'll have to look that up a little bit later. Okay, and then he says, and then the Rav Shulchan Aruch had said, "Ve'ein tzarich lomar she'asur la'acher," that it is forbidden to look into what the activities of what your friend is doing, to see his affairs. Rod Salomar, de im lamishu hu darba osa chatzar tzarech lizoher, kol sheken lamishu lo darba osa chatzar da asr lihistakel lachatzar chaveiro. He says, if it's usher for the neighbor himself to look at his neighbor's activities in a shared courtyard, then surely someone who doesn't even live in one of those houses would not have permission to just, as he's walking by, to look at what the neighbor is doing. Okay? Lachatzar chaveiro, into the courtyard of your friend. Mi shaba liftoach chalon lachatzar chaveiro, bein chalon gedola, bein chalon ketana, bein lamayla, bein lamata. He says, if a person wishes to add a new window to his house, but the window that he wishes to add will give him visual access to his friend's yard, and it doesn't matter whether it's a large window or a small window, whether it's high up or whether it's low down, in all situations, Baal hechatzer ma'akev alav. Nonetheless, the owner of the person who is now going to have whose yard is now going to be open to the other person's view, can legally prevent him from adding that window. Shahare Omer Tazikli Biriya, with the argument that I don't want you harming me with your gaze. The Afal Pishuhu Gavoa Ta'ale Besulam V'tireh. And even if the space is, I'm not sure if he's referring to the window or he's referring to the courtyard itself, maybe on a higher plane. Yeah, I think what he means to say is like this. He's saying, even if the window is lower and the courtyard is higher, and the neighbor says, but I can't see what you're doing because my window is lower than where your courtyard is. Nonetheless, the neighbor could claim that maybe you'll climb up a ladder and you'll be able to see what I'm doing. In other words, at any time there is added visual visibility that is added to my neighbor's courtyard through an act of construction, I must obtain permission halachically before I'm allowed to add or do any kind of renovation, which is going to give me view of my neighbor's activities where that visibility was not there before. And this is true, by the way, if let's say you're building a house, you're building a new house, and the new house is going to have full visibility to another neighbor's courtyard. You would have to obtain permission in order for that to be permitted. There's a new set of houses that went up at the end of my block on Springgate and Atkinson, where there was just a wooded area before. And I was thinking, because I noticed that the neighbor who lives next door to that construction, to those newly constructed houses, put up his house for sale. And I'm just wondering if legally the person who was putting up those new houses had a legal obligation to obtain permission from that neighbor. I'm putting up a house next to you. and I'm going to be building windows which will now have access to your backyard, it would seem that he would have to ask for permission. But remember, according to the Chazon Ish's argument, the Chazon Ish said that today, where people don't use their backyards for completely private activities, the halacha is not as stringent. And you don't have to. There's an assumption that it's okay to open up a window to someone's backyard. But it's really not so clear to me. It
You don't
definitely.
need permission.
What's that?
You don't need permission for the windows.
Oh, David, hi. Okay, so
Hi.
you don't need permission from the city, you're saying, right?
No, as long as you comply with the bylaw, you're good to go. There are percentages of openings you can put on the side yard of a house. The only time a neighbor can make a claim on anything is if you have to go to a committee of adjustment. Let's say because of setbacks or building length, they can say, he's going to obstruct my view or whatever, which in many cases could hold, on some level, but in many cases it does not. And when you're putting glass or windows on your backyard, you're unrestricted. You can do the entire back wall of the house all glass, and you don't have to ask for permission for anything.
Even though it'll be, even though your neighbor now is, his privacy. He feels that his privacy has been invaded.
Yeah, well, you're not breaking any bylaw. There's no bylaw restriction to the amount of glass you can put on the backyard of your house or to the front of your house facing the street. The restriction is for fire regulations only on your side yard, and it's about 7% of openings.
I'm just wondering if the two people are from Jews and they want to abide by halacha, whether the halacha would have a higher standard than the municipal bylaw. It's just something interesting to think about, right?
Yeah.
So, and also what we also haven't discussed, maybe we'll get to this in a future halacha. What about if I put up a new addition to my house that now obstructs my neighbor's view or obstructs my neighbor's sunlight? How much light that he gets into his house on a daily basis? Are there any laws about that, David? I know that when we were looking at doing some development to the shul, one of the things that the architect told us is that you have to look at. They even have computer programs that can project how much shade a new structure will place upon the adjacent properties.
Correct. And there's there's differing rules for that type of construction for high rises. I mean, there's different rules for that. But in a residential setting, number one, if you comply with the existing bylaws, it means to say you don't have to go to the committee of adjustment for any minor variance. You can build the structure as you want it to be, as long as you're in compliance. The minute you're not complying, then your neighbors can show up at the hearing. They will have a chance to see the drawings, your proposal, and they can raise objection to it. And then you have a council that at the end of the day will make a ruling on it.
All right, we have to go because we're over time. I'm sorry, I wasn't watching the clock. So maybe we'll pick this up in Mitzvah Shem on Monday. Okay, everybody.